My guest this week is Dr. Gill Hart, who I consider to be one of the most informed people about the subject of food allergies and food intolerance. She's a real scientist, actually an expert biochemist who started her career up the road from where I live in London at Hammersmith Hospital in London in the 1987, getting her PhD at that point. And later, this century, so to speak, joined YorkTest, which is one of the most reputable laboratories who've pioneered and initiated a lot of the research that exists around the subject of food intolerance, which she has been very much involved with. She's an expert in food intolerance testing and also consumer health testing in general. So it's very good for me to have this opportunity to talk with you, Gill, Dr. Gill Hart. Welcome to my podcast.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you very much for inviting me along today to talk with you.
I mean, the first big confusion that exists out there is really the difference between an allergy and a food intolerance. So could you explain that for us?
It's a really good question, and there's an awful lot of confusion around this subject. A lot of people think they have allergies when they actually have food intolerances. So if you think about the differences, when you talk about allergy, you talk about that immediate response to a food. You usually know if you've got an allergy, a reaction to, say, peanuts or shellfish, milk, eggs, and symptoms are, potentially life-threatening. This is a really serious condition. And, that is very different to what we see when we talk about food intolerances. Food intolerances take on a number of different forms. People consider things like celiac disease as a food intolerance, also things like lactose intolerance, reactions to your high FODMAP foods, that's your carbohydrates that you find really difficult to digest, and sensitivity to things like alcohol and histamine. Lactose and histamine intolerances are enzyme deficiencies, usually genetic. And so, there are lots of different forms of food intolerance. What we focus on very clearly at YorkTest is that we measure food-specific IgG immune reactions to foods, which we use to guide an elimination diet. These are often called non-IgE, so they differ from the allergy. They're the IgG rather than the IgE. They're often called non-IgE immune reactions, or sometimes confusingly delayed allergy, and it's not surprising. People do get confused. So we measure the food-specific IgG immune reactions to foods. Now, when people react via an IgG antibody, that reaction is delayed, it's subtle, it develops really gradually. So somebody might eat something, say, on a Saturday, and may not have a reaction for a number of hours or even days. It may be even like the Tuesday that they start to see symptoms. Typically not life-threatening, not necessarily even lifelong. I think we're going to talk a bit later about the gut, but I think, by protecting yourself and looking after yourself, you can sometimes reintroduce food back into your diet and tolerate it again. So it's not like an allergy, which is more of a developed into adulthood, is more lifelong.
So, I mean, during these sort of COVID times, we've heard a lot more about antibodies. Antibodies are things that our immune system specifically produces to target something. So, for example, the purpose of a vaccine is to produce antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So what happens, as I understand it, is that the immune system produces antibodies against foods. And there's a type of antibody, IgE, which causes a much more severe reaction, which we call an allergy. And there's a type called an IgG, which causes generally a less severe and not so immediate reaction, which is what we call food intolerance. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, people sometimes think of antibodies quite rightly as protective. They are protective, but only to a certain degree. Your IgG antibody, comes in 4 different subtypes, and each of those have been linked, to certain diseases and conditions. So the immune system is a very complex thing. So when we're talking about protective antibodies, your food tolerance, if you like, can easily be pushed into food intolerance and inflammation, and that's what we see when we're measuring our IgG antibodies.
And also, I'm actually allergic to dairy products. So I have an IgE sensitivity, and that means that my reaction to dairy products, fortunately, it's not life-threatening, but it occurs, within minutes. So it's very quick. And it doesn't matter if I've avoided it for ages. And people get confused because you mentioned, for example, lactose intolerance. Some people don't make the enzyme, lactase, which digests milk, lactose, and they're not necessarily allergic to dairy. They just have an enzyme deficiency, and that means that the milk sugar can't get digested. And if it doesn't, bacteria in the gut that can cause loose bowels, diarrhea, bloating, etc., etc. That's neither an allergy nor an immune-based food intolerance, but it's often called.
No, it isn't. Yeah. So no, it isn't, and it's people do get confused about that as well. I always think about it in terms of molecules because I'm a biochemist, and you need quite a large molecule, a protein-sized molecule, to form an immune response. So it's your food proteins, if you like, that are either contributing to, in your case, your dairy allergy, producing an IgE, or your, in my case, my dairy intolerance, which produces an IgE. With lactose, you're talking about sugar. Now, sugars can't raise an immune response, but they need to be digested somehow by an enzyme, as you say, the lactase. So if people quite often come up positive, to milk on a food-specific IgG test, and then go and buy lacto-free milk, and that isn't any help because that's just removing the sugar, not the actual milk protein, which is the cause of their intolerance.
A couple of times I've heard people say I'm allergic or intolerant to magnesium, to vitamin C, to sugar. And I said, well, that's not really possible. It's got to be a protein of some sort, hasn't it?
It does. And, I've in the past, I've actually seen companies, which I will not name, claiming to measure IgG responses to things like ascorbic acid and formaldehyde, which again is actually not possible. So it's an interesting topic.
And which is more common, IgE allergy or IgG food intolerance? How many people are suffering?
Yeah, well, allergies typically 6 to 8% of children and around 2% of the adult population suffer from allergies. And if you do suffer from an allergy, then we know that you need to go and see your GP and allergy specialist for specialist support. Statistics on food intolerance are much harder to collect, actually. And it's estimated too that 3 to 4 times as many people think they actually have a food allergy than they actually do. So a lot of people do think they have a food allergy when it's actually an intolerance. We've throughout the year, I've been with YorkTest for 16 years, and we've looked at various estimations, and we think it's people with food intolerance is probably somewhere between 45 and 65% of the population. If you think about it, if you go to a meet up, when we can, with a typical, friends and family group, you'll soon find those within that group that are avoiding certain foods because they disagree with them, and that's where food intolerances are coming into play. Interestingly as well, I think many people have food intolerances without knowing it. There's a lot of people that, maybe have low energy, low mood, digestive problems, and actually just think it's normal for them, or think it's something to do with their busy lifestyle or stress, without actually realising that it is linked to food. And I think that a lot of people think they're absolutely fine too, that they don't have any symptoms, and it's not until they actually remove the food from the diet they think, oh, actually my normal life could be with a lot more energy, which is great for them.
What are the most common symptoms of a food intolerance?
Well, for food intolerance symptoms, they really focus around the digestive system, as you'd expect. So things like IBS, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, etc. But also low energy, low mood, skin conditions, acne, psoriasis, conditions linked to autoimmune diseases, things like your ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, migraines and headaches as well. And we collect a lot of data at YorkTest, and these are typically the sort of symptoms that people come to us with. And people that come to us describe their symptoms. So 38% of people that come to us describe their symptoms as very severe. Another third as severe. And 80% of people that come to YorkTest have been suffering for more than a year with their symptoms. These are things that are really impactful.
And generally, how long does it take for somebody to start to notice an improvement if they discover and eliminate their food intolerance?
Well, we conducted the largest study of this kind which we published with the University of York back, it's a long time ago now, it's 2007. And we looked at 5,286 different people that had gone through a food-specific IgG test through YorkTest and been helped to change the diet. And we found that typically 68% of those who saw an improvement actually saw a difference within about 3 weeks, which is quite remarkable. And the other thing that, the great thing about this study was that we asked people to introduce foods back into their diet that they'd eliminated after about 3 months. And 93% of them actually got their symptoms back, which is absolutely your proof that, your elimination diet and then what we call a challenge, you're challenging that food back to yourself to see if it is the actual food, which shows that it's an active and specific response.
Now, that's both very interesting and perhaps a little concerning, because there is this idea that unlike IgE allergies, which I have, and it doesn't matter if I avoid dairy products for 2 years, I will still react, although I've learned how to mitigate that reaction. IgGs can be unlearned, I believe. And yet this study was suggesting that most people aren't. They're still reacting to food. So how can you unlearn a food intolerance? And I know there's some that just don't go away.
There are, and I think it's very much down to the individual. What I will say is that in order to sort of unlearn your food intolerance, you need to put in place a few sort of building blocks for yourself, really. You don't just remove the food from your diet. You also need to look at strategies to protect your gut, really protect your gut moving forward. So you may, we talk about the 5 R's, removing the food, replacing the food with something equally nutritious, which is obviously really important, re-inoculating your gut with, probiotics, something to rebalance your gut microbiology, so that you're not you're not kind of letting these larger food particles through into your bloodstream that your body is then seeing as foreign and sort of going eek, reacting to. And then, repairing the gut and then reintroducing the foods back in. And I think 3 months is probably a little bit too soon to do that, although people sometimes say that helps. Certainly, when you do reintroduce the foods, it's often that you learn your tolerance levels. So you find the balance of foods that's right for you. I have a dairy intolerance. I know that I can have tea and coffee, milk and tea and coffee now, but I wouldn't, go near a block of cheese or ice cream or a big, creamy pudding, because I know that would impact me. So I think having removed, dairy for many, many years, I can tolerate a little bit, and I've learnt my level. And I think, that's where, people, take responsibility for their own diets and learn what's right for them after realising what causes the problem in the first place.
That introduces the interesting notion of the sort of degree of intolerance and also quantity, because as I understand it, those IgG antibodies are floating around in your bloodstream. And if you eat a food, and also I presumably, especially if you're not digesting foods especially well, if those proteins end up in your blood, I understand that they bind to the IgG antibodies, and it's when there's a sufficient quantity that the immune system is hyper alerted. So is this how it works? And is that why sometimes you can get away with a small amount of a substance, but not a large amount?
I think absolutely. I think it goes back to, what we were saying earlier about the sort of the level, you was thinking about an antibody as being protective. But I think that, there is, an increased knowledge now around the immunology behind the IgG and how that can go on to, promote inflammation. And so I'm trying to think of a good example, actually. I think recently there's a study in that when we think, I can give you an example. When we think about inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, we think about that as being, something that is helped by an IgG guided elimination diet. And I think what we find there is that, and there's recent knowledge now that there's a really high positive correlation between some types of neutrophils, for example, that actually link together with the food antigen and the Fc gamma receptors and the antibodies, and accumulate, those complexes accumulate, in the colon, in colon biopsies that were taken. And it shows there the direct link between what's actually going on in the immunology. The IgG levels have been pushed so far that they're actually starting to accumulate as complexes in these polymorphonuclear PMN neutrophils, and actually then triggering the neutrophil activation and induced inflammation. Now, at very low levels, that may not happen, but once you're building these complexes, that can. I mean, that's just one example, but it's a very interesting recent study actually that's just been published on this.
Yeah, I mean, what I do when I have a client that's got food intolerances, my sort of period of avoidance before retesting is 4 months. And in the first month, I give them a supplement which contains both probiotics and some glutamine, which helps to heal the gut, and also some digestive enzymes, quite a wide range, but not because I believe we all need digestive enzymes, but I want to ensure in that month, as the gut heals, that everything is broken down properly, so we're not getting excess undigested proteins getting through into the blood. And I also say you need to avoid or greatly reduce the use of alcohol and painkillers. Is that the right kind of stuff? Yeah,
I think when you think about how your gut is being impacted, when you think about things that can impact the gut and the importance of the gut as well to, in your gut health, the gut microbiology in your gut health, we've got 1,000 different bacterial species, sitting in your gut, 100 trillion organisms. These are essential in there for us to survive, and we don't want to destabilize them. So what you're doing in terms of your gut healing protocol is absolutely right. But on the other side of the coin, we need to think about things that can destabilize and do destabilize your gut microbiology. So, things like pollution, food additives, processed foods that are poor nutritionally, and also things like painkillers, alcohol, and, things like antibiotics and stress as well. Your poor gut, is trying to balance your immune system. 70% of your immune system is present in your gut. It's trying to balance an awful lot of things. And we're starting to know an awful lot about which microorganisms are present in the gut. But there is so much more to learn, and actually very little known yet about, the interactions, what characterizes the interactions between those microorganisms in the gut and the breakdown and assimilation of nutrients, which they inevitably do for us. And I think, this very fine balance means that, there's an awful lot going on there. And it's not surprising, really, that this sort of breakdown and gut destabilisation can result in things like, your typical food intolerance symptoms, your IBS, low energy, headaches, etc., that can arise from this. It's absolutely key.
And how bad is alcohol for promoting this environment for food intolerance? Is there a quantity that we can have, some forms that are worse than others? And I think I would say the same thing with painkillers. In other words, if someone has a bit of a binge and has a bottle of wine or whatever, does that immediately mean that their gut becomes more susceptible in the next 24 hours?
I'm not sure how quickly it would be. And I think clearly binging alcohol is not healthy for your gut. And the gut becomes more permeable with alcohol as it does with painkillers. So, you can start a process whereby, you've got a build-up of alcohol intake, a binge maybe, and that can inevitably start to destabilise your gut microbiology and, your immune system there. So, as we've always said, Patrick, everything in moderation, and and I think that just counts here too.
If you did drink too much one night and maybe take some painkillers in the morning and then tested your food intolerances, might you test worse? In other words, is it wise to avoid alcohol for 24 hours before a food intolerance?
I think your IgG antibody raises very slowly. So, it's a gradual build-up over a period of time. And so I don't think you're going to see that immediate change to your IgG reactions just because of a one-night binge. It's not something that's going to happen that quickly. You've got a very slow build-up of your IgG antibodies. They've got a very long half-life. They're very stable. They stay a long time in your blood. A period of months. So it's not something that's, you're not going to get great big changes in your IgG levels day to day. I do my IgG test every year, and I've always got milk antibodies there, even though I've avoided it for quite some time because I have a tiny little bit. Your IgG levels are really quite consistent, actually, from day on, week on, until you change your diet. And, we find people that, for example, they may take out dairy and they may replace it with soy milk, and they might start feeling better, and then they may, plateau a little bit. And, this is what happened with me. And then I did my test a year later and found I was reacting to soya. And made some of the changes as well, and I know what suits me now. I know that I have coconut milk, I know that I have hemp milk, and that suits me. So again, that's something to sort of think about.
So what are the most common foods and drinks that people are reacting to? What's the sort of top 6 or so?
Oh, Patrick, I'm always asked this question. And, before I talk to you today, I actually went in and I do this quite often, actually. I go in and review the laboratory results that are coming out of our own wonderful laboratory. And it always amazes me how individuals react so differently to each other. Every result is unique. My reactions are to cow's milk, almonds, flaxseed and egg white. Out of those people that come to us, those who have positive reactions, react to, we test for over 200 foods, react to about between 5 and 8 different foods. Mm-hmm. And I can't really say what the top 6 are, because if I said the top 6 for one person, for me, that would be very different to say you, Patrick, or somebody else. So it's, it can be all sorts of things. And, as I say, we test for over 200 reactions to over 200 different food and drink ingredients. And, you will see people that eat more of a certain thing. People do eat more dairy, do eat more wheat, gluten, etc., eggs. You will see more of those because people eat more of them and are more likely to then, twist and turn into a reaction. But equally important are those things like your lentils, your carrots, your fruits and vegetables, and things that you perceive as being healthy actually, but still contain protein and still have the ability to translate into a food intolerance.
So talking about wheat, you mentioned celiacs, which is an intolerance to wheat, but it's not an IgG or an IgE. It's slightly different, isn't it?
Yes, it is different. I mean, it's an autoimmune condition. So the antibodies that are raised there, when you're reacting to gluten, is when your gluten is combining itself with these antibodies, these anti-mycel, anti-transglutaminase antibodies, which are used in the celiac blood test, and then they together translate into a real horror of a combination which can cause lifelong problems and lifelong damage. So it's really, really important, if you suspect you have celiac disease, that you go and get tested by your GP and get a follow-up test. And that is it's a real serious lifelong condition.
So if you do test IgG positive, for example, on a YorkTest to wheat, and I know your test tests both the gliadin portion, which is what people react to most in gluten, and to wheat, is it then worth having a celiac test just to rule that out?
Well, years ago, people used to use gliadin-specific IgG as a celiac test, but it wasn't a very good one. That's why we now use, your celiac blood antibody tests. But I think the gliadin IgG is very useful for non-celiac gluten gluten sensitivity, which is a disorder in itself, actually. And something that's very, very widely recognised by the medical community, the use of gliadin-specific IgG for, gliadin intolerance. I don't think it necessarily translates that if you've got a gliadin IgG, you've definitely got celiac disease. But if you're concerned about it and you think that you're reacting to gluten gliadin, absolutely, you should go and get tested for celiac.
And we also hear about, one of the most sort of classic are eat right for your blood type, which is based on the idea that different blood groups respond to different lectins. And lectins are found in foods such as nuts and seeds and beans and lentils. There are all sorts of food that contain lectins. So there are some books, I'm thinking of Grundy's book on eating a lectin-free diet. What is the connection between lectins and IgG food intolerances?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There's a lot about lectins around, and they're fascinating molecules, absolutely fascinating. But like any food proteins, undigested lectins, or, if you've got a permeable gut or, a gut that's out of balance, these, lectins are, they are a carbohydrate binding protein, so they are a protein. So like any food proteins, they can still get through, through into your bloodstream if your gut's out of balance, and promote an immune response. So, my view is that if you think you might be reacting to lectins, rather than just taking them out of the diet blanketly, I think, if you look at an IgG reaction test, that's going to be telling you if you're reacting to the lectin protein, and that in itself should be enough. I'm always reluctant I'm always hesitant about diets that are very generalist, even specific to blood types, actually, because I think they can, they're not necessary for most people. And, we have strategies in which we can actually say whether you're reacting to the lectins in your legumes or grains, etc.
So really lectins is another protein, and rather than and of course lectins are in just so many foods, rather than just sort of avoiding all those foods that are generally high in lectins, sometimes they're in the skins of foods as well.
Yeah.
which nutritionally we like to eat. So if you have an IgG test, you will actually find out which foods containing those lectins you are reacting to. So it's very specific for you. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to, this personalized approach to, to determining what looks good for you as an individual.
And I remember, when I first came into this field in the 80s, we spoke about hidden or delayed allergies. I think we used that term. The point was people who were reacting to foods, but not necessarily that day, often 24 or 48 hours later. And then gradually this understanding about IgG antibodies came into the fore. And that was, back in the 80s. But and also this has been considered by some members of the medical profession to be kind of quackery as such. Now, you've been at the forefront of research. How much research is there in relation to IgG food intolerances? How much scientific evidence is there that this is a really real and important issue in relation to health? And are you seeing a shift in opinion in the medical and nutrition research community?
Yeah, absolutely, Patrick. It's a really good point. YorkTest has been going 40 years next year, which is quite incredible. We launched our food-specific IgG test in 1998. And, I think we're in a unique position in this, home health testing market for food intolerances. Because we've got our own laboratory. We've got our own laboratory headed up by two great HCPC registered biomedical scientists. We've got accreditation to medical device ISO standard, the ultimate in quality control, really, because we've got, we do everything from manufacturing the ELISA test, so that's the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, that the hospital standard test we use to measure the food-specific IgG, quality control of that, right through manufacturing the tests themselves, to doing the test, to releasing the results, to working with and supporting people that are taking the test. We're really, really proud of our team. And we've been involved in many, many independent studies. And, as you say, when we started talking, 16 years ago or so, there weren't as many studies around. We were seeing people get better, but without so much of the evidence-based. Now, there are many, many more independent studies. Most months studies are coming to the fore. And, there's great evidence that an IgG-guided elimination diet can help people. What is still to be, to find out more about is the immune system, as we've talked about. But, since 1998, we have published our own data. We've been totally transparent about our own data. We talked already about the study in 2007. We used over 5,000 people, and 76% of people on that study told us that they felt better, and that their symptoms got better. We as a company, as YorkTest, keep having to prove to ourselves that we're being effective, and we do that by surveying our the people that take the test on a regular basis. We have a quality review board twice a year, and we review our feedback data, and we consistently see that 80, 81, 82% of people are feeding back that they are, and these are hundreds of thousands of samples now, over, you can imagine, since 1998. We did take a big step last year, and that we actually commissioned an independent study. It's not been published yet, of 565 people, and it was totally separate to us. And 565 people who'd taken the YorkTest and been supported through their elimination diet. And I waited at the end of December with bated breath for the results. And the results were that 82% of people fed back that doing the test had a positive impact on their health and well-being. and 91% were very pleased with the whole experience. Now, that to me, after publishing back in 2007, getting a very similar result, just shows how consistent, our data is, and that we are still doing something that's very effective. But as I say, there's a lot of independent studies, hundreds of independent studies now that are gradually building that research base further to show that a guided elimination diet, which in the end is I see it as a fast track to eliminate an elimination diet. Mm-hmm. So, rather than starting with an elimination diet that's taking one thing out of a time from your diet, you're starting with some actual knowledge of where to start. So elimination diet is, as you know, is virtually impossible to do. Mm-hmm. Taking one food out at a time, replacing it back in, you can never really get a grasp. I don't think I'd have ever determined my 5 or 6 foods, by using that method. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more knowledge now, and a lot more understanding about the way that IgG can translate into intolerance and further damage.
Yeah, so rather than just eliminating all foods and then bringing one in at a time, which is incredibly hard to do, or just guessing which your foods are, and possibly you may even guess right for some, but not others, and leave them in. So you never get to a baseline of no reaction. The point is, if you have something like your premium food intolerance test, you start with that information. And I want to just break that down, because in a sense, there are 2 parts to this. One is if you have an IgG specific food intolerance test, like the premium food intolerance test, the first thing is it accurate in the sense that if I test myself on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or send in 2 different samples, will I get the same results? That's like part 1. And the second part is that the cause of my particular problems? So they're kind of 2 different questions. So first of all, is this reproducible? I mean, that's
yeah. I mean, as I've said, we have the ultimate in quality control through our laboratory, because we have actually got our own laboratory, and we're doing a blood test. And so, when we look at the sort of metrics we collect on a daily basis, we're looking at the levels of quality controls that we run with every single sample. We're talking about running match split samples through our laboratory several times a week, and we have a key performance indicator, if you like, that we monitor on a monthly basis when our laboratory feeds back all those results to us. And myself to review, and that shows that we have greater than 98% reproducibility, which for this type of ELISA is very good. So, in terms of if you're looking at reproducibility, then that's where we sit. In terms of effectiveness, as I've already talked about, the sort of data we're collecting in huge volumes, hundreds and thousands of data points each year, and feedback from our people that are taking the test, and that is in itself, showing that this is an effective response. I also think that if you look at the demand for food intolerance testing, we may not have accurate statistics about how many people, whether it's 45% or 65% of the population, but the demand for food intolerance testing, because people are then taking the test, being supported by our nutritional therapists through changing the diet, and then going out and telling their friends and family. And, that to us is, an ultimate positive feedback, really, when somebody's recommended what we do.
Now, one of the problems in this area, and you can maybe explain this better, but I understand that the sort of the panel of food proteins that you have and introduce a person's antibodies to from their blood sample is not the same between laboratories. So there are some labs running IgG tests who have produced different results, not quite like, having your blood sugar measured or your cholesterol measured. And I mean, I tried different labs to sort of get a sense of them. One nearly always shows rice, which is not a food that I seem to react to in others. So you get these sort of variable results. So what's that about between laboratories? Yeah,
there's a few things here, actually. I think to start with, if we're talking about food-specific IgG tests, there are a number of tests available that just measure IgG4 only. Now, IgG4 is about 4% of the IgG, and actually it's IgGs 1 to 3 that are the ones that are particularly linked to symptoms. So if you actually compare the YorkTest with, tests which measures all 4 types of subtypes to one that measures only 1, you may expect to get a different result. The other thing is the design of the ELISA test, that's the enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, is absolutely key. If you have an imbalance, as you say, the quality of the food allergens that we use in that test is absolutely key. But I've been developing my whole career. I've developed, immunoassays for hospital standard for all sorts of different types of tests, and that ELISA test design is absolutely key. We use a proprietary blocker that actually blocks non-specific binding, because otherwise you will see things like your unusual foods that may be being over-reported. And in order to maximise reproducibility, reliability, test consistency and robustness, that ELISA test design is absolutely critical. And that might be why differences are seen. Unfortunately, there aren't international standards available for comparing results. But I think 22 years, 23 years of consistent data, it speaks a lot with our own laboratory too. I think there's something else to be said about food intolerance. Food intolerance, I'm using inverted commas, although you can't see me doing that with my fingers. Food intolerance test types on the market, because sadly and unfortunately, the food intolerance test market has been flooded with tests which have no basis in science at all. And this has been, sadly, an area of testing that's still under-regulated, something I've pushed for regulation for many years. So there are a lot of hair tests. It was actually a few years ago, it used to be Vega testing. Now it's hair testing for food intolerance, which is where you put a sample of hair into some sort of machinery that tells you with energy waves, what you're reacting to, not just foods, but bacteria, viruses, metals, all sorts of things. And, these things have no basis in science, no better than chance at all. And sadly, these are flooding the market at the moment, and people are, believing that they are working, and you cannot measure these things from hair. It's not possible.
Yeah, I like you. I've used different labs, but I've used the YorkTest quite consistently over the past 20 years, I think. And I do a test myself every year to find out where I'm at. And it's very interesting. Yeast as such is a food that often comes up, and it's been very helpful. And I've sort of got 2 questions, and one of, is a little bit more sort of personal for me, but would you generally say that a healthier person is likely to have a smaller number? In other words, if you have somebody with a lot of food intolerances and then do the right thing, would you expect that number to decrease? So yes, that question.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think when we see people, which, as I say, the average number of foods people react to is between about 5 and 8, say, out of the 200. But when we see people with a lot of reactions, our laboratory will highlight that out. We will talk to that individual, and it's usually because of some, quite severe gut dysbiosis, and that means that they need that extra level of support in terms of gut healing, and I think that's really important, in terms of looking after that person. Yeah, so I do think, and then once that gut healing has been put in place, I know that my dairy intolerance, my reaction to milk, used to be incredibly high. We we actually provide a scale with our results. So we've got a red, amber, green. The red is high levels of reactivity. The green is normal reactivity. The amber is a borderline. But we also provide a number that goes with that result. So, for example, my number, used to be up in the sort of 50s, 80s. Mm-hmm. For, it's now down at sort of the 20 sort of level, mm-hmm. and we can track that through, which is, it's great for people to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. So yes, the total number. So you can add up your numbers and then you find out what your broad intolerance is. I had one young man had terrible gut problems, and he actually came up red in the highest reaction to every single food. I've never seen that, but just there was no food that he could eat that he was not reacting to. So he had some major gut problems. So going a little bit close up on some foods, and I'll use my own as an example. So yeast. Well, we've spoken a bit about wheat and gluten, and I was absolutely fascinated by 26 studies now on ancient wheat called Kamut Khorasan, which actually reduces inflammation. It got me thinking that it may not be so much wheat that is a bad food or gluten that is a bad substance, but rather that maybe we've modified, hybridized, and thus altered the sort of genetic profile of wheat a lot because it's a very commercial food, while something like rye, much, much less so. And then yeast seems to come up a lot. Have you got any thoughts about yeast and why that would be so? Because obviously yeasts have been around, since we've been around.
Yeah, I agree with you about the wheat. I think the ancient wheats and the ones that we've been typically evolved to eat, suddenly we're seeing, an evolution of that with change going on, and the body can therefore see that as reacting differently. With your traditional yeasts, there's an awful lot about yeast in terms of, the way the gut's interacting. And I wonder if it's just the yeast on its own or whether it's that in combination with other things. So, yeast, as you say, hasn't been modified over the years. It is still traditionally as it was. And so I'm wondering whether that in combination with, the other things that we've talked about, things like your alcohol, clearly linked with yeast, and with, other types of things that can impact the gut are working in combination. You've also got then the sugar in diet, which fuels yeasts. So you've got, things like, the sugary diet, which encourages yeast growth anyway, and then of course the whole Candida story too. So it's far more complex than I think than just looking at the yeast itself.
And then the other food, which for me is sort of interesting, as I do usually come up with a reaction to egg white, but it's one food I've never noticed any symptoms from. And being kind of oriented towards a vegetarian or fishitarian type diet, eggs is quite an important, protein source for me. Yeah. So I've seen that quite a lot. What's your view about eggs?
Well, I think it's interesting that you say that you don't get symptoms from a food. I think what we do is we give people a starting point for an elimination diet, and for people to try those foods that are the highest reactivity for them, and that's where people are seeing a difference. In terms of egg, they're clearly very antigenic. They've got a very strong degree of being able to form an antibody, and so it may be that for you, the antibodies are formed there, but they haven't then gone on to produce, or been pushed into the intolerance boundary, if you like. For there, of course, eggs are very important to the diet, and if you don't find that eggs impact you, then there's no direct reason to remove them. But it might be something to be mindful of if you're eating a lot of eggs, for example.
Yeah, well, so in other words, what we've learned is that if you have from a proper laboratory, and YorkTest absolutely leads the field, an IgG test, it is accurate, 98% accurate. It is going to measure accurately whether or not your immune system is producing IgG antibodies, which cause food intolerances. Not always will they be symptomatic, but it gives you the information. It tells you the foods that are on the suspect list. And if you eliminate those foods and feel a lot better with whatever is your problem, be it digestive or migraines or inflammation or joint pains or asthma or skin problems, any of the wide symptoms associated with food intolerance, if you do feel better, then you know you're in the right zone. And then after 4 months, and especially if you've followed a strategy to heal the gut, and probiotics may help for a period of time, digestive enzymes, glutamine, not having too much alcohol, painkillers, and so on, you can then start to reintroduce the foods one by one and see what happens. I generally say, introduce a food, wait 3 days before you introduce another. Is that a pretty good summary of the state of play?
It's a great summary, Patrick, I think. More than ever, particularly with the pandemic, people are looking to optimize their health, to, resolve current issues, but also to protect themselves and reduce the risk of them being ill in future. And I think that's where, YorkTest have traditionally helped with food intolerance testing, where we're working now with our home health testing and looking to the future with, accessible home health tests in general. And, it's a bigger picture too of looking at nutrition, but looking at health as well in general, and how, nutrition and diet and lifestyle can really help optimize your health. And, and we can all feel empowered to change our health by looking at what's going on inside of us, whether it's our IgG antibodies or other health tests.
Well, thank you very much for sharing all your wisdom, and also thank you for being at the forefront with YorkTest on really raising the standards and making sure that there's a reliable test. Do check out YorkTest.com, not only for its food intolerance test, like the premium food intolerance. There's a very good junior food intolerance test. And by the way, you buy these kits and they're sent to you. You prick your finger, you follow the instructions, send it back, and then get the results within a few days. Also, if you are concerned about having a food allergy as well, and not just a food allergy, you can have an environmental allergy. There's a combination food intolerance and food and environment allergy kit, so you can measure both. I am particularly grateful because for myself and all my clients, you give me a really good discount, and I'm very happy to share that with anyone who's listening. The discount code is PH30, but you need to go to YorkTest.com/corporates, YorkTest.com/corporates to get that discount using the code PH30. So, Dr. Gill Hart, thank you immensely for being my guest on this month's podcast.
Thank you, Patrick. It's always a pleasure, and it's been a great conversation today. Thank you.
All the best.